He made a choice that shocked everyone. His parents turned their backs, his friends laughed, and society put a cross on him. But 2 years later, those who mocked him regretted it. Watch to the end, and don't forget to subscribe. Write in the comments where you're watching from. Daniel Harris had always been the golden boy of his family. Born into wealth, raised with privilege, he was groomed for success from the moment he could walk. His father, Richard Harris, was a respected real estate mogul, a man who had built an empire brick by brick, turning their family name into one of the most powerful in the industry. His mother, Margaret, was the perfect counterpart, elegant, calculating, and utterly devoted to the social standing of their lineage. They had expectations for their only son, expectations that had been set in stone long before he had the chance to form desires of his own. He was to attend the best schools, which he did. He was to obtain a degree from an Ivy League university, which he did. He was to take his rightful place in the family business, which he had done seamlessly. The last piece of the puzzle was marriage. Not just any marriage, but the right one. A union that would secure their legacy, strengthen their position in society, and ensure that the Harris name continued to be spoken with reverence in the right circles. For years, Daniel had gone along with their plans, not out of obedience, but because it was simply easier than fighting back. His entire world was structured, a series of decisions made on his behalf, and he had no reason to question them. That was until he met Amara. She was unlike anyone he had ever known, not because she was different in the way that his family would define it, but because she was free. She had grown up with none of the privileges he had, yet she carried herself with a confidence and ease that made him envious. She didn't calculate her every word or move to fit a mold. She simply existed as she was, unapologetic, authentic, and entirely captivating. He had met her at an art exhibition, a place he had gone to out of obligation rather than interest. It was an event hosted by a close associate of his father, and Daniel had attended simply to make an appearance. He had expected the usual, a crowd of self-important people sipping champagne and discussing art they barely understood. But then, amid the sea of tailored suits and carefully curated personas, there was Amara. She was speaking passionately about a piece of art that everyone else had dismissed. A simple painting, understated, but to her it was something more. Daniel had never seen anyone so engaged, so animated in their words. He found himself drawn to her, not just by her beauty, but by the sheer force of her presence. He introduced himself, half expecting her to recognize his name and react accordingly, but she didn't. She treated him like just another person in the room, and for the first time in his life, he found that exhilarating. What started as an innocent conversation turned into something neither of them expected. They spent hours together that night, and in the weeks that followed, they saw each other whenever they could. With Amara, he felt something he had never felt before: freedom. He could speak without filtering his words, laugh without worrying about perception. She challenged him, made him think, forced him to see the world beyond the carefully curated existence he had always known. But with that freedom came the inevitable confrontation with his family. The moment they realized his relationship with Amara was serious, their disapproval was swift and absolute. At first, it was subtle: pointed comments, disapproving glances, the assumption that it was a phase he would soon grow out of. But when he told them he was going to marry her, the facade of civility crumbled. His father didn't speak for a long time after he made the announcement. He sat in his chair, his expression unreadable, the silence thick and suffocating. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold, measured, as though he were discussing a business deal gone wrong. "You're making a mistake, Daniel." His mother was less composed. "You cannot be serious," she said, her voice high with disbelief. This is a joke. You cannot possibly think that this is an acceptable match." Daniel had anticipated resistance, but he had not expected the sheer depth of their disdain. They spoke of lineage, of reputation, of expectations. They reminded him of his duty to the family, of everything they had done for him, of the future that was meant for him. They talked about their name, their empire, the things he would be throwing away. But not once did they ask if he was happy. He listened to their words, let them throw their arguments at him like weapons, but his decision had already been made. He had seen a world outside of theirs, a life that wasn't dictated by status or obligation, and he wasn't willing to give that up. His friends were no better. The jokes were relentless, laced with arrogance and condescension. They treated his decision like a source of entertainment, as if it were a ridiculous experiment that would inevitably fail. "Come on, Dan, really? You, married to her? How long do you think this will last? You know you're going to regret this, right?" They laughed because they couldn't understand. They laughed because they believed he would wake up one day and realize his mistake. They laughed because, in their world, love was secondary to power and image. The wedding invitations went out, but responses were scarce. Some family members outright refused to attend. Others made excuses. His parents remained distant, neither accepting nor fully rejecting his decision, as if they believed ignoring it would make it disappear. But Daniel wasn't seeking their approval. For the first time in his life, he was making a choice that was entirely his own. The day before the wedding, his father called him into his office. The large oak desk between them felt like a wall, an impassable barrier that neither of them could break through. "If you go through with this," his father said, "understand that you are making a choice. And choices have consequences." Daniel met his father's gaze, unwavering. "I understand." Richard Harris studied him for a long moment, then simply nodded. The conversation was over. The next day, Daniel stood at the altar, waiting for Amara. The room was filled with an unusual mix of people: her family, her friends, a handful of his own who had chosen to support him. There was tension in the air, but when he saw Amara walking toward him, all of it faded away. She was radiant, her eyes shining with the same determination he had seen the first day they met. In that moment, he knew he had made the right decision. The vows were exchanged, the rings slipped onto fingers, and with one kiss, their union was sealed. The whispers didn't stop. The disapproving glances didn't fade. But none of it mattered. Because for the first time in his life, Daniel Harris was exactly where he was meant to be. The morning of the wedding dawned cold and gray. The sky, heavy with clouds, seemed to reflect the tension that had been building for months. It was supposed to be the happiest day of Daniel's life. But instead, there was an uneasiness in the air, an unspoken weight that pressed down on everything. He stood by the window of the small hotel room he had rented for the night, staring out at the city that had once felt like his own. Now it felt distant, foreign, as if he were standing on the outside of his own life, watching it unfold without truly being a part of it. He knew the day would not be easy. He had known it from the moment he proposed to Amara, from the moment the invitations had gone out and the silence had come in return. The wedding list had been trimmed not by choice, but by rejection. People had declined, some politely, others with open scorn. His parents had never directly said they would not come, but he had not expected them to. They had made their stance clear. The night before, he had sat alone with his thoughts, replaying every conversation, every argument, every moment when someone had tried to convince him that this was a mistake. It would have been easier to give in, to walk away, to follow the path that had been laid out for him. It would have been easy to bow to expectation. But when had easy ever meant right? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was his best man, his only remaining childhood friend who had stood by him despite the pressure from the others. The look on his face was a mix of concern and resolve. "They're here," he said quietly. Daniel nodded, taking a deep breath before turning away from the window. The venue was small but beautiful. Amara had wanted something intimate, something real. It was not the grand spectacle that his parents would have arranged, not the high society gathering they had envisioned for him. It was quiet, elegant, filled with warmth rather than obligation. Her family was there in full support, their presence a stark contrast to the absence on his side. As he stood at the altar, waiting for her, he could feel the weight of the room. His mother had arrived, though she sat stiffly near the back, her face a mask of forced neutrality. His father was not there. Most of his relatives had not come. The few who had made it were watching with guarded expressions, their discomfort evident in the way they sat rigidly in their chairs, as though they were bearing witness to something they could not comprehend. Then Amara walked in. Everything else faded. The tension, the judgment, the empty seats, they all became background noise. She was the only thing that mattered. Her dress was simple but breathtaking, and the look in her eyes told him that despite everything, she had never once doubted him. When she reached him, he took her hands in his, feeling the warmth of her fingers, the steady pulse beneath her skin. In that moment, he knew that no amount of disapproval could change this. The ceremony was brief, the vows spoken with quiet certainty. When they were pronounced husband and wife, the applause was sparse, hesitant from some, heartfelt from others. He could hear murmurs, could feel the eyes on him as they walked down the aisle together. At the reception, the divide in the room was glaring. Her family celebrated, her friends laughed and danced. On his side, the few who had come mostly kept to themselves. His mother left early, offering only a cold nod as she exited. A few of his old friends approached him, some under the guise of support, but their words were thinly veiled mockery. "So, this is it, huh? You really went through with it? Can't say we didn't warn you, mate. Well, good luck, I guess. You're gonna need it." He ignored them. Their opinions no longer held weight. Later that night, when they were finally alone, Amara sat beside him, her fingers tracing absent patterns along the back of his hand. She didn't need to ask if he was all right. She already knew. "We did it," she said softly. He looked at her, at the woman he had chosen despite everything, and for the first time that day, he allowed himself to breathe. "Yes," he said, squeezing her hand, "we did." But as the city lights flickered beyond the window, as the last of the guests disappeared into the night, he knew that the battle was far from over. This was only the beginning. The morning after the wedding was quiet. The air felt still, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel lay awake in bed, watching the soft light seep through the curtains. Amara was still asleep beside him, her breathing steady, her face peaceful. For a moment, he let himself believe that everything was fine, that the battle had ended the moment they had exchanged vows, that love had won, and nothing else mattered. But reality had a way of creeping back in, as relentless as the tide. His phone had been buzzing all night. Missed calls, unread messages. He had ignored them, unwilling to let the outside world invade the fragile space they had carved out for themselves. But now, in the cold light of morning, he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. Carefully, so as not to wake Amara, he reached for his phone and scrolled through the notifications. There were messages from distant relatives filled with thinly veiled disappointment. A curt text from his mother, "Call me," and an email from his father, the subject line stark and unforgiving, "Your decision." Daniel hesitated before opening it. He knew what it would say. His father had never been a man of many words, but the few he chose carried weight, like stones dropping into deep water. "Daniel, you have made your choice, and now I make mine. You are no longer a part of this family. Do not expect financial support. Do not expect reconciliation. This business, this legacy, is not yours anymore. You knew what was at stake, and you proceeded anyway. You have chosen your path. Now live with it. Richard Harris." He stared at the words, feeling the finality in them. There was no anger, no attempt to reason with him, just a simple statement of fact. His father had erased him. A deep breath shuddered through him. He had expected this. He had known it was coming. And yet, seeing it written out, cold and unyielding, still felt like a punch to the gut. Amara stirred beside him, her fingers brushing against his arm as she turned toward him. Her eyes fluttered open, still heavy with sleep, but the moment she saw his face, she was awake. "What is it?" Her voice was soft, but there was an edge of concern beneath it. He hesitated, then passed her the phone. He watched as she read, her lips pressing into a thin line, her fingers tightening around the device. "I'm sorry," she said finally, setting the phone down. "I know this isn't easy." He shook his head. "I knew this would happen." "That doesn't mean it doesn't hurt." She was right. It did hurt. Not because he wanted their approval. He had made peace with the fact that he would never have it. But because it meant the final door had closed. There was no going back. The fallout spread quickly. His parents cut off his access to the family business, removing him from every account, every investment, every asset tied to their name. Friends, at least those he had thought were friends, distanced themselves with quiet efficiency. Invitations stopped coming. Calls went unanswered. It was as if he had ceased to exist in their world. At first, he didn't care. He told himself that none of it mattered, that he had made the right choice, that he didn't need their approval or their money. But reality had a way of making itself known. The apartment he had lived in was paid for by his family, and within a month, the lease was revoked. His credit cards were frozen. The safety net he had never truly realized he relied on was gone. Amara offered to dip into her savings, but he refused. She had worked too hard for what she had. This was his burden to bear. So they moved. A smaller apartment, a different neighborhood. It was a far cry from the luxury he had known, but Amara made it feel like home. She filled the space with warmth, with laughter, with small touches that made it theirs. Finding work was harder than he had expected. His degree, his connections, they had once been his greatest assets. Now they were tied to a name that no longer supported him. His applications were ignored, his calls unreturned. He had been Richard Harris's son, a future titan in the world of real estate. Now he was no one. He took whatever he could find. Temp jobs, short-term contracts, anything that would keep them afloat. He came home exhausted, his hands aching from work he had never thought he would have to do. But when he saw Amara waiting for him, her smile as bright as ever, he knew he would endure it. But the world was not kind. The whispers never stopped. Strangers who recognized him from his old life gave him looks of pity, of amusement. He overheard them sometimes in cafes on the street. Look at him now, the prodigal son, the fool who threw it all away. He ignored them, but ignoring did not mean it didn't hurt. The worst came when he ran into an old friend, someone who had once been closer than a brother, someone he had trusted. The conversation had started cordially enough, the usual pleasantries exchanged, but then the tone shifted, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the truth beneath it. "You know, we all thought you'd come to your senses by now," his friend had said, sipping his drink with a smirk. "But here you are, still playing house. How long are you going to keep this up?" Daniel had clenched his fists beneath the table, forcing himself to stay calm. "I didn't make a mistake," he had said, his voice steady. His friend had laughed. "Yeah? Tell me, how does it feel to be a nobody, to have lost everything?" Daniel had stood up then, leaving without another word. He didn't need to defend himself. The life he had chosen wasn't something he regretted. But that didn't make the weight of it any easier to carry. Amara had noticed the change in him, the heaviness that settled into his shoulders. She never pried, never pushed, but she knew. One evening, as they sat together on their tiny couch, she took his hand in hers and said, "I see you." He looked at her, at the woman who had stood beside him through everything, and something in him softened. "I know it's hard," she continued, squeezing his hand, "but we're in this together." He exhaled slowly, letting himself lean into her warmth. They had lost much, but they had each other. And that, he reminded himself, was worth more than all the wealth in the world. Still, deep down, he knew that something had to change. He could not live in the shadow of his past forever. It was time to build something new. The months that followed were a test of endurance, a slow grind against the weight of uncertainty. Daniel had always known stability, always walked through life with the quiet assurance that no matter what happened, his name, his family, his wealth would be enough to keep him afloat. Now, that safety net was gone. Every bill that arrived in the mail was a reminder of just how precarious their situation had become. Every rejection email, every unanswered job application chipped away at the quiet confidence he had once carried. Yet, through it all, Amara remained steadfast. She never faltered, never let the strain of their circumstances dull the brightness in her eyes. She worked tirelessly, taking on more projects, more commissions, stretching herself thin, but never once complaining. She carried herself with the same unshakable resolve that had drawn him to her in the first place, and Daniel, watching her, knew that he had no right to wallow in self-pity. He had to find a way forward. The idea came to him in pieces, scattered thoughts that refused to settle until one evening, as he sat across from Amara in their cramped kitchen, he finally saw the full picture. She was sketching, her fingers moving fluidly over the page, lost in her work. It was something she did when she needed to think, when she was solving a problem in her mind before she spoke it aloud. He had seen that expression countless times before, and now, watching her, something clicked into place. "What if we build something together?" The words were out before he had fully formed the thought, and she looked up at him, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "Build what?" "A business," he said. "Something real. Something that's ours." She set her pencil down, leaning forward slightly. "Go on." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair as he tried to untangle the rush of ideas in his head. You have talent, Amara, more than anyone I know. And He hesitated. I have connections, or at least I had them. I know how businesses work, how to scale something from nothing. What if we combined that? What if we created something that blends both our worlds? Her eyes searched his, thoughtful. What kind of business? He hesitated again, then gestured to the sketchpad in front of her. You care about sustainability. You always have. You're always talking about how businesses should be doing more, how we need better solutions instead of more waste. She nodded, intrigued but still cautious. What if we created a design firm that specialized in eco-friendly solutions? Architecture, interior design, product development, things that don't just look good but actually make a difference. He paused. It won't be easy. It won't happen overnight. But we could make something real, something that lasts. She was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then, slowly, she smiled. Let's do it. They started the next morning. At first, it was just the two of them, working from their tiny apartment, using what little savings they had left to buy a domain name, set up a website, and register their company. They called it Nova Designs. Simple, modern, and full of the promise of something new. Daniel reached out to old contacts, people who hadn't entirely turned their backs on him. Some ignored him. Some offered polite rejections, but a few, just a few, were willing to listen. Amara worked on branding, on refining their vision, sketching out ideas and mock-ups to showcase their potential. The first few weeks were grueling. They pitched to anyone who would listen, sent out emails that were met with silence more often than not. They faced rejection after rejection, doors closing in their faces before they even had a chance to step through. But they didn't stop. Their first break came unexpectedly. A small eco-conscious cafe in the city was looking to redesign its interior, and through a mutual acquaintance they managed to secure a meeting. Amara presented their concept with quiet confidence, walking the owner through her designs, explaining how every material, every element, was chosen with sustainability in mind. Daniel handled the business side, negotiating terms, ensuring they could deliver on their promises without stretching themselves too thin. By the end of the meeting, they had their first client. It wasn't a massive deal. It wouldn't make them rich. But it was something. A start. They threw themselves into the project, working late into the night, making sure every detail was perfect. When the cafe finally reopened with their designs in place, the response was overwhelming. Customers noticed. Word spread. Other small businesses began reaching out. Slowly, their name started to mean something again. Not because of Daniel's family, not because of his past, but because of what they were building together. With each project, their reputation grew. They reinvested every dollar they made, expanding their reach, refining their services. They hired their first employee, a designer fresh out of school, passionate and eager to learn. Then a second. Then a third. Months turned into a year, and suddenly they were no longer just two people in a cramped apartment, struggling to stay afloat. They were business owners. Entrepreneurs. They were proving everyone wrong. But success, as they quickly learned, came with its own set of challenges. Larger clients started showing interest, companies that saw potential in what they were doing. But with that interest came scrutiny. People remembered who Daniel was. They remembered his name, his family, and they questioned whether he was truly capable of standing on his own. His father's influence still cast a long shadow. It was an unspoken reality that followed him into meetings, into negotiations. Some people refused to take him seriously, convinced he was just another rich man's son playing entrepreneur. Others, perhaps worse, saw an opportunity. They tried to leverage his name, to use his estrangement from his family as a way to gain favor. Daniel refused to engage. He let their work speak for itself. And yet, despite their progress, there were nights when doubt crept in, when exhaustion weighed heavy and the pressure felt unbearable. One night, as they sat in their now slightly larger office, reviewing contracts long after the city had gone to sleep, Amara reached across the desk, taking his hand in hers. "You know, we're actually doing this, right?" she said softly. He looked at her, at the woman who had stood beside him through it all, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe it. They were doing this. They had built something from nothing, defied the expectations of everyone who had doubted them. And yet, deep down, Daniel knew that the hardest battles were still ahead. The city glowed beneath the amber street lights, its pulse steady and unyielding. Inside the Nova Designs office, Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the finalized contract that lay before him. The numbers at the bottom of the page were staggering, enough to shift the course of everything they had built over the past 2 years. The offer was real. The opportunity was real. And yet, he hesitated. The road to this moment had not been smooth. Every step forward had come with obstacles, with setbacks, with moments that tested his resolve. But they had endured. The cafe project had been the start. Small businesses followed, intrigued by the concept of sustainable, aesthetically striking spaces. Their designs merged function with intention, artistry with environmental consciousness. Slowly, the demand for their services grew. A boutique hotel hired them to revamp its interiors, then a co-working space, then a high-end clothing brand looking to redesign its flagship store. With every project, they refined their vision. They expanded their team, bringing in young, innovative designers who shared their passion. Amara led the creative direction, pouring herself into every detail, every concept. Daniel handled the business side, negotiating deals, securing investments, making sure their foundation was strong enough to support their rapid growth. There were months of uncertainty, of long nights spent hunched over laptops, running calculations, debating strategy. But there were victories, too. The first time they were featured in a major design magazine, the first time a client came to them because they had heard about Nova Designs rather than the other way around. The moment that changed everything came unexpectedly. A journalist, intrigued by their rising reputation, reached out for an interview. At first, it seemed like just another feature, another chance to showcase their work. But the article, when it was published, took on a life of its own. The headline was bold. From Outcast to Innovator, How Daniel Harris Built a Legacy Without His Name. The story was everywhere within days. It wasn't just about the designs, it was about him, about Amara, about the journey they had taken, the risks they had endured, the walls they had broken down. Investors took notice. Larger clients, corporations that had once ignored them, began to reach out. Their inbox flooded with inquiries. Suddenly, they were no longer just a promising startup. They were the future of sustainable design. Daniel should have felt triumphant. But as he sat there, pen poised over the contract, he found himself remembering the warnings, the doubts, the whispers that had followed him from the beginning. Was this success truly his? Or was it just another way for the world to tie him back to his father's name? A familiar voice broke through his thoughts. You've been staring at that contract for 20 minutes. He looked up to see Amara standing in the doorway. She was barefoot, her hair slightly tousled, wearing one of his shirts over her leggings. She crossed the room, setting a cup of coffee in front of him before perching on the edge of his desk. "What's holding you back?" she asked, her gaze steady. He exhaled, running a hand over his face. "It's a big step." She nodded. "But we're ready." He knew she was right. This was what they had worked for. This was what they had fought for. Still, part of him wondered, would they look at him and see the work he had done, or would they only see the son who had fallen from grace? As if reading his mind, Amara reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," she said softly. "Not to them, not to your father, not to the people who doubted you. This is about us, about what we've built, and no one can take that away." The knot in his chest loosened. He picked up the pen and signed his name. The months that followed were a whirlwind. The deal opened doors they had only dreamed of. Their designs were sought after internationally. They traveled to different cities, different countries, meeting with clients who wanted a piece of what they had created. Articles continued to follow them. The power couple changing the face of sustainable design. The unlikely rise of Nova Designs. Daniel found himself in rooms he had once thought he would never enter again. Galas, industry events, spaces filled with the kind of people who had turned their backs on him years ago. Some greeted him with polite recognition, others with outright surprise. His name was no longer an anchor. It was a question. Had he done this on his own? Yes. Had he built something without the shadow of his father's empire looming over him? Yes. And yet he knew that the whispers would always be there. That some people would always believe that he was either running from his past or benefiting from it. But he no longer cared. The moment he knew, truly knew, that they had made it, came on a cool evening in Paris. They had just finished presenting a project to a client, a massive contract that would take their company to an entirely new level. They walked along the Seine afterward, the city lights casting golden reflections on the water. Amara slipped her hand into his. "Do you remember the night we sat in our apartment, trying to figure out how we were going to pay rent?" she asked, smiling. He laughed. "Vividly." She leaned against him. "We did it." He looked at her, at the woman who had been his anchor, his partner in every sense of the word. "We did." And for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe it. The world had a way of shifting when success became undeniable. The same people who had once sneered, who had whispered behind his back, who had treated his choices as foolish rebellion, now spoke his name with a different tone. Respect, curiosity, even admiration. It was subtle at first, a nod of recognition at industry events, a polite inquiry from an old acquaintance. But as Nova Designs continued to rise, as their name became synonymous with innovation and sustainability, the shift became more pronounced. Daniel saw it in the way journalists who had once ignored his pitches now requested interviews, eager to document the journey of a man who had defied expectations. He saw it in the emails that filled his inbox, from companies that had previously dismissed him, now eager to collaborate. He saw it in the invitations that began arriving, each one an attempt to pull him back into the circles that had once cast him out. But the most telling sign of all was the message from his mother. It arrived one evening, just as he and Amara were wrapping up a late-night meeting. He had almost ignored it, assuming it would be another carefully worded dismissal, another reminder of the divide that remained between them. But when he opened it, the words were different. "Daniel, Your father and I have been following your success. We are proud of what you have built. I would like to see you. Please call me Mother." He stared at the screen for a long time, rereading the words, searching for the hidden meaning beneath them. Amara, noticing his silence, set her pen down and leaned closer. "What is it?" He passed her the phone. She read the message, her expression unreadable. When she finally looked at him, there was no surprise in her eyes, only quiet understanding. "They see you now," she said. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Now that it benefits them." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "So, what are you going to do?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window, at the skyline of the city that had become his home. The answer was there, somewhere between the lights and the shadows, between the past and the future he was still shaping. 2 days later, he made the call. His mother answered on the first ring. "Daniel," she said, and for the first time in years her voice was soft, uncertain. "Mother." A pause. Then, "How have you been?" He almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. How had he been? He had built an empire from the ashes of his former life. He had faced rejection, isolation, failure, and still found a way to rise. He had become the man he was always meant to be, not because of them, but in spite of them. "I've been well," he said simply. Another pause. Then, carefully, she said, "Your father would like to see you." The words should have meant something. Once they would have. But now they felt like an afterthought, an obligatory extension of her own request. "I don't think that's necessary," he said, a sharp inhale on the other end. "Daniel, I built this without him," he continued, his voice steady, "without either of you. And now that I don't need you, now that the world is watching, suddenly you're proud of me?" "That's not fair," she said, and for the first time there was emotion in her voice. Real emotion. "We were worried about you. You abandoned me." Silence, then softer. "We didn't know what else to do." He closed his eyes, letting the words settle. Maybe they were true. Maybe they weren't. It didn't matter anymore. "I don't need your approval," he said finally. "I never did." He could hear the breath she took, the way she held it, as if searching for something to say that would change the course of the conversation. But there was nothing left to say. "Take care of yourself, Mother." He ended the call. When he turned, Amara was watching him. "You okay?" she asked. He exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." It was not the reunion they had wanted, but it was the closure he needed. And as he stood there, looking at the life they had built together, he realized something. He had never been freer. The invitation arrived in an embossed envelope, the kind his parents had always favored. It was heavy, expensive, the edges gilded with subtle gold leaf, a mark of wealth, of status, of a world he had once been a part of. He found it on his desk one morning, resting atop a pile of contracts and design proposals. At first, he thought it was a mistake, that somehow someone from his old life had forgotten he no longer belonged. But when he turned it over and saw the crest of the Harris family embossed in the wax seal, he knew it was deliberate. His father was hosting a charity gala, a grand event, one that would be attended by the city's elite, the very same people who had once looked down on him, and for the first time in years, they wanted him there. Amara found him standing by the window, the invitation still in his hand, his expression unreadable. "They want you back," she said softly. He exhaled, fingers tightening around the thick cardstock. "They want to show. They want to see what they lost." He turned to her then, searching her face for any sign of hesitation, of doubt. but there was none. She had stood by him through every storm, through every rejection, through every moment where it would have been easier to walk away. She had never wavered. "They'll expect me to come alone," he said. She lifted an eyebrow. "Then they'll be very disappointed." He smiled at that, the weight in his chest easing just slightly. When the night of the gala arrived, the air was crisp with the first signs of winter. The city gleamed under the lights, the streets filled with the quiet hum of cars and distant laughter. The venue was familiar, an opulent ballroom in one of the city's oldest hotels, a place he had been to countless times before, back when his name still carried weight in these circles. But tonight, he wasn't just Richard Harris's son. He was Daniel Harris, co-founder of Nova Designs, a man who had built something with his own hands, a man who had nothing left to prove. They stepped through the grand entrance together, the murmurs starting almost immediately. Heads turned, conversation stilled. The people who had once dismissed him now watched with open curiosity, with thinly veiled surprise. His mother was the first to approach. She looked elegant, poised, the very image of high society. But there was something in her eyes, something softer, something hesitant. "Daniel," she said, her voice carefully measured. "You came." He nodded. "You invited me." Her gaze flickered to Amara just for a moment before returning to him. "You look well." "I am." A pause, then, "Your father's expecting you." Of course he was. He found Richard Harris standing near the stage, surrounded by business moguls, politicians, people who wielded influence like a weapon. His father was older now, the lines on his face deeper, his hair streaked with more gray than Daniel remembered. But his presence had not diminished. When their eyes met, the conversation around them stilled. "Daniel," his father said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who was used to being heard, "I was beginning to think you wouldn't show." Daniel stepped forward, his posture relaxed but firm. "And miss such a warm welcome?" A few polite chuckles echoed around them, but the tension in the air was thick. His father studied him, his gaze sharp, assessing. "You've made a name for yourself." Daniel didn't flinch. "I have. And yet, you're still my son." The words were careful, deliberate, a reminder, a claim. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Is that why I'm here? So you can remind everyone that no matter how far I go, I'll always be tied to you?" His father's jaw tightened, but he did not look away. "You built something impressive," he said instead, ignoring the challenge in Daniel's voice. "Nova Designs is making waves. People are paying attention." "You mean they're paying attention now," Daniel corrected. His father sighed. "This industry is about perception, Daniel. You know that." Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "I know that better than anyone." Another pause. Then his father said, "What do you want from this?" Daniel met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "Nothing." His father exhaled, slow and measured. "You've always been stubborn." "No," Daniel corrected. "I've always been my own person. You just never wanted to see it." Silence stretched between them, the weight of years hanging in the space between father and son. Around them, people pretended not to listen, their gazes darting between the two men, waiting for the next move. Daniel didn't give them one. He turned, his hand finding Amara's, his grip firm, grounding. "We should go," he murmured to her, and she nodded, falling into step beside him. As they walked away, he could feel his father's gaze on his back, could almost hear the unspoken thoughts that lingered in the air. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care. He had won. not in the way his father measured success, not in power or control or influence. He had won because he had built a life that was truly his own, and no amount of approval or regret could ever change that. The city stretched out before them, a canvas of lights flickering against the deep velvet of the night. From the balcony of their apartment, Daniel stood with his hands resting lightly on the railing, watching the world below. The hum of traffic, the distant sound of laughter from a nearby rooftop bar, the gentle breeze carrying the scent of rain. It all felt like a quiet symphony of a life he had once thought impossible. Behind him, Amara was curled up on the couch, a cup of tea in her hands, flipping through a sketchbook filled with designs for their latest project. She was always working, always thinking, her mind a well of endless creativity. It was one of the things he loved most about her, the way she poured herself into everything she did, the way she never stopped pushing forward. They had left the gala without looking back. The moment they stepped outside, the weight of it all had lifted, like a door quietly closing on a past that no longer had power over them. His father had not followed, had not called out after him, and Daniel had not expected him to. Whatever had been left to say had been said. For years, he had carried the idea that he needed to prove himself to his family, to the world that had cast him out. That if he built something great enough, strong enough, they would have no choice but to acknowledge him, to recognize that he had never needed their approval in the first place. But now, standing here, watching Amara hum softly to herself as she sketched, he realized something. It had never been about them. Everything they had built, every late night spent working, every risk they had taken, every moment of doubt they had fought through, had never been about proving anything to anyone but themselves. They had carved out a place in the world that was entirely their own, free from expectations, from obligations that did not serve them. And that was more valuable than any legacy his family could have offered. He turned back toward the living room, walking over to sit beside Amara. She glanced up at him, smiling softly before setting her sketchbook aside. "You're thinking," she said. He chuckled. "Dangerous, I know." She nudged him with her shoulder, warmth and laughter in her eyes. "Tell me." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair before resting it on her knee. "I've been thinking about what's next." She studied him for a moment, waiting. "We've built something incredible," he continued, "but I don't want to stop here. I don't just want Nova Designs to be another successful firm. I want it to mean something. I want to create something that lasts, something that actually changes the way people think about design, about sustainability, about the spaces we live in." Her smile widened. "That sounds like something we can do." He leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I don't want to do it without you." "You never have," she said simply, and it was true. Their journey had started with nothing but a shared vision and the determination to make it a reality. They had faced rejection, doubt, and loss, but through it all they had stood side by side. And now, as they sat in the home they had built together, looking toward a future that was entirely their own, Daniel knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was all that mattered. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to check out our other videos for more inspiring content. Share this video with your friends and let us know what you think in the comments.